Hello, this is John Friedland with AGWS. Welcome to our webinar series today. Today we have The Big Squeeze is Coming. For our webinar series, we have our Vice President of Training, Bob Harkins, joining us, as well as David Robertson, AFIP, President and Executive Director of the Association of Finance and Insurance Professionals today.
Thank you very much, John Friedland. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. As Dave Robertson and I have the opportunity to chat with you fully today about the #1 hot button topic in our industry. Most of you know what that is. That would be compliance and ethics, applying the law, selling with integrity, and indeed, really, for every dealership in America to establish an in-house, effective, and ongoing compliance and ethics program, now commonly referred to as a CMS, or Compliance Management System. As John said, we're very pleased to have Dave Robertson with us today. Dave, of course, once again, is the Executive Director of AFIP. That would be the Association of Finance and Insurance Professionals. Many of you know AFIP. This was established in 1989. What I think is really amazing and truly a testament to what they do, AFIP now has certified nearly 60,000 individuals, a combination of dealership employees and lender and vendor personnel, as it relates to the AFIP multi-level state and federal regulation AFIP certified program for professional finance and insurance managers. So Dave, welcome aboard. It's great to have you with us.
Glad to be here, Bob.
Today we're getting into The Big Squeeze is Coming. We're going to discuss, first of all, emerging challenges and continuing attacks relating to the pricing and sale of finance and insurance products. Secondly, we'll get into the newly released, just April of this year, a couple months back, the NADA Model Dealership Policy for Voluntary Protection Products. And last but certainly not least, as part of that NADA Model Dealership Policy, the NADA Best Practices for Menu Presentations and Disclosures. Hey, let's start with the emerging challenges and continuing attacks. You know, many people have said that when it comes to people that we should to look to and where these challenges are coming from, many people say these are the top 6. I want to get your opinion on that. But the top 6, of course, are the finance sources that buy our paper, potentially, the attorneys general of our respective states, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, DOJ, Department of Justice, and last, certainly not least, and sometimes I think they're the #1 that should be listed, would be the predatory litigators. So, Dave, your thoughts with these, if you would, please.
Well, you know, predatory litigators, really, it's the plaintiff's bar. So it's the nice folks that don't want to defend us. But let's go through our list and talk about the stop, look, and listen. And what you have to remember is that all of these sources have a purpose for their existence, and their existence is to ensure that consumers are treated fairly. So how you bring them into the picture sometimes depends on your actions in the store. Now, the finance sources are the ones that are the buyers of the paper, so to speak. So they're the ones that you've executed binding legal documents that are accepted on assignment from them. And so they have within their dealer agreements a series of policies that apply to the pitching, the soliciting, and the execution of installment sale agreements. So at #1, if you haven't read the installment sale agreement you're asking customers to sign, you put yourself in a vulnerable position. And I'm not talking about the front of it, I'm talking about the back as well. So you cannot comply with the standards imposed by your finance sources unless you're cognizant of that information. Let's talk a little bit about the Attorney General. And this has changed the game considerably because they are the state law cops. And with the demise somewhat of the CFPB, certainly a neutering of it, then the FTC has picked up the gauntlet and teamed up with the state attorneys general. And what we've done now is that we have a police force for the FTC. And we have people out there that are more than willing to enforce the state laws. So all of this is going to come down to where do you leave yourself vulnerable for oversight or action by these people. It all comes down to, have you read your documents? We'll talk later about the policies and procedures you should have to work through those documents that you have not somehow inadvertently or on purpose run afoul of them. CFPB still contains will remain in its advisory role. They are now one of the pushers for caps on aftermarket products. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. The Department of Justice, I can tell you, when you're in a Department of Justice situation, it's not a happy time. I'm approved by the Department of Justice to do court-mandated training off their consent decree, and I can assure you the last thing you want is the Department of Justice in your store. Let's talk about the plaintiff's bar or your predatory litigators. The problem with this is that we give them grist for their mill. In other words, they're going to take whatever they can find and see how much they can exploit it. The problem typically is what triggers them into the action only uncovers something that's a more juicy apple as it relates to them taking you to court. So the short answer to this is that, number one, you have to have knowledge of the contracts you ask people to sign. You have to abide by a code of ethical conduct. You have to be cognizant of the controlling state and federal regulations, and have to deal with the customer in such a way that you don't trigger either the finance sources, the Attorney General, the FTC, the CFPB, Department of Justice, or your predatory litigators.
And that's great stuff. A little bit later, I know we're going to get more involved with the CFPB and their announcement that they really plan to this year launch their program to limit the profit from the sale of F&I products and services. But I want to spend a couple of minutes more on the Attorney General or the Attorneys General from respective states. Many of you know me when we come to the store and we talk about things relating to the law firm of Hudson Cook and Carlaw, the F&I legal desk book. But another Hudson Cook thing that they provide for our industry is their spot delivery newsletter. And if you have not seen yet the June issue of the spot delivery newsletter, it's right on target with what Dave Robertson is talking about today. And the top billing, the number one article in the June spot delivery newsletter is written by Attorney Jean Noonan from Hudson Cook. She's from their Washington, D.C. office. And the title of this article is Service Contracts. When is a voluntary protection product worthless? What is a voluntary protection product worthless? And she talks about litigation with a store dealer group in Pennsylvania that were selling, as they call, warranties, but probably really service contracts to people that were leasing vehicles for 3 years, 36,000 miles, and because everything was under coverage under the manufacturer's limited warranty, did not really have a need for the vehicle service contract. Well, long story short, reading on, as I read just a couple of lines for you on this, the Pennsylvania Attorney General, in this case, pounced on the dealership, alleging that the product failed to provide any meaningful value to the consideration paid by the customer. Following along with that, the AG's press release was even blunter, and the headline said that the dealership sold, quote, valueless warranties, and then in colorful language, the press release quotes the AG as saying, quote, this dealership took its customers for a ride and built customers out of their hard-earned money. That was the quote from the AG from the great state of Pennsylvania. Well, they entered into an agreement, entered into an assignment, and the money was paid. And then we learned from the AG's office that Pennsylvania is a state that has what they call a nuclear option. Kind of interesting. And what that means, Dave, with this one, as we read this, a future violation entitles the AG to a civil penalty of up to $5,000 per violation. But the big hit is this, and that is Pennsylvania law also includes this nuclear option. And that means for the violation of an injunction, the court order, the AG can ask the court to revoke the dealership's right to do business and appoint a receiver of the dealership's assets. So Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, that's when the name on the sign changes out front. Would that be true?
Well, they would have no choice because the person that signed the agreement with the manufacturer doesn't have the authority to act upon it. But here's the point we want to make. If you're working in an F&I box, you know you're selling products to a customer that have no value to that customer. You knew that when you sold it, and you knew that when you had them sign the form. So when we talk about, woes me, look what the regulators did to us, that was a self-inflicted wound. And I can tell you Pennsylvania is not a state that you really want to do a second offense in, because that new process has teeth. But it goes back to when you're sitting in that F&I box, you're looking that customer in the eye, and he trusts you enough to buy what you're trying to sell him, that the value received is not commensurate with the price paid, or in this case, it never had any basis to start with.
Today, we're told, or I'm told, that a number of these state AGs really have and are developing a mini CFPB. Is that true?
New York State, I just was in New York working on this, wants to start their own Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And if you read automotive news, there's probably some motivation to do that. But what they loved was the following things. Number one, it's focused on areas that they deem important. Second, the CFPB collected $6 billion in penalties for its length of time in business. Now, I did a presentation the other day in another state. We talked about marks on the board, and we talked about high growth. Well, I wasn't talking about a car dealership. I'm talking about regulators. Because if I'm a field rep for a regulator and I want to get promoted, it's no different than a car dealership. How many dealers can I bust, and how much money can I generate? So it's marks on the board, and it's gross. So you have people out there who are motivated for their own career and upholding the law to get really aggressive and look for what we're doing when we're violating the law.
Today, again, in March, the CFPB announced that they're going to launch their program to limit the profit from the sale of F&I products. NADA, compared to what they've done in the past, at least in my opinion, has been very proactive as a result of that. And what they've developed is the NADA Model Dealership Policy for Voluntary Protection Products. The author is our friend Paul Mitri. Many of you know Paul. Paul is NADA Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, also Chief Counsel for Financial Services. Many of you know Paul Mitri in that name because Paul also was the author of the 2014 publication, the NADA Fair Credit Compliance Policy and Program that they put together as the result of what the CFPB and DOJ was doing with respect to discrimination and finance reserve and things of that nature. So Paul has put this together, his staff, the Model Dealership Policy for Voluntary Protection Products. Quite frankly, the covered pages of this, or the contents, is comprised of 18 pages. 4 of them are how-to pages on how to put this together in your store. But the meat of it really that we're covering today is just 4 pages, 4 templates. And that's going to be 2 pages of policy, and then also 2 appendices. So, Dave, would you take us through the introduction, the instructions for completing the VPP policy template, then we'll get into the templates, and we'll show the policy poster and also the certification form as well.
Yes, I'm going to preface that with an explanation, is that when we get into value received for the amount paid, when we get into shared risk products, insured products like service contracts or GAP, it's going to be difficult for especially a regulator to determine what would constitute a fair value for that product relative to the price paid. So we're putting ourselves into a strange situation where we're not dealing in concrete constructs here, and we're dealing with people that don't necessarily love us to start with. So in a preemptive move and a very good leadership move, they created the program that we're going to talk about now on voluntary protection products. And the key to this is, number one, the consumer has to be made aware of, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, that what the products that we're offering are voluntary protection products. There's nothing in there that will influence the car price, the financing, anything. So the customer has to have a clear understanding that this is an optional product. Now, the other part is you have to have a formal policy, and it came out in the form set up to create a formal policy. Number one, the dealer is going to have a policy statement. You're going to have instructions for completing the policy template. You have various templates that we'll talk about later on. But when we get into the meat of this, you're going to see it is very intensive and quite specific. So let's kind of work through it, Bob, and see what we want to talk about on that.
Yeah, let's go to this first appendix. This is really page 17 of the NADA program. This Appendix A, and it's the poster that they say you will display. Let me just kind of read through this. Name of dealership offers vehicle service contracts and other voluntary products that are designed to protect your investment in a vehicle you purchase or lease from us. The purchase of any of these voluntary protection products is completely optional and is not required to purchase or lease the vehicle or obtain warranty coverage, financing on particular terms, or any other product or service offered by the dealership. Our dealership is fully committed to providing you the price, terms, and conditions of each voluntary protection product before you decide to purchase it. So I know, Dave, would you comment on this? I know you've talked to Paul Meeker about this, on how this can be maybe a word or two added based upon product or gap or something like that, and where this really might be displayed in the store. Can you address that?
Yes, I mentioned to Paul, I thought we should add gap, because I hate to tell you this, I want to sell the products in the poster. But what I recommended to Paul is that rather than put this in a showroom, and there's many other things competing for the customer's eyesight in a showroom, that maybe we have a poster that's on the desk of an F&I person. But it is alerting that customer that whatever you're trying to sell them is in fact voluntary and has no bearing on that transaction.
So any other added gap maybe, would you say?
I would say gap's enough. I don't want to tire the wheel. Now we're getting into a little bit farther than Paul Meeker is probably willing to go.
Okay. Let's go next to Appendix B. That's the Voluntary Protection Products Certification Form. And this thing, step us through this, talk about how the top reads and how we fill this thing out, the allowable discounts, which is kind of similar to what Paul did with the Fair Credit Compliance Policy and Program, where you had 7 allowable reasons to reduce the APR. But that was all based upon things that had been really decided on by the Department of Justice a number of years ago. This is a little bit different. So take us through the standard retail price, selling price, and some of these discounts, and then the importance of their reviewer certification.
The first thing you need to know is that it's different than the original NADA policy on disparities, because on that one you had to fill out a form on every deal. Under this program, you only fill out the form if you deviate from your set policy. And so what you do is you have to identify the customer, the date, the vehicle. You have to have the product that's going to be offered. Now keep in mind, we're talking about both single products and bundled products that we could buy, the silver plan or that type of thing. We have to put the standard retail price, and we're going to talk a little bit about setting that price. You're going to have to talk about the amount you actually sold it for. And if the selling price is less than the retail price, enter the number of the allowable discount from the list below. This is somewhat similar to the disparate pricing. And we have a limited by pricing or payment cap. In other words, we can only go so far. Customer stated a monthly payment constraint. We can't go over the customer's target monthly payment. Customer stated a competing offer. I don't know if that'll show up much, but it could be a factor. Customer qualified for a dealership promotional VPP campaign. So now you have latitude within this policy to get out and do some special pricing and market your product. And the customer qualified for dealership employee incentive program obviously is self-explanatory. So you have to record then in your form the reason why you did it, okay? And then if the discount 3 is selected, enter the name of a competing offer and the price of the competing offer. So I think we're going to get a little bit hazy when we get that far on how much I want to drill down the customer in terms of why you can buy it for a lesser price at another store.
The number 2 is on there. Again, if discount 2 is selected, enter the amount of the monthly payment constraint. So if the selling price is less than the retail price, enter the number of the allowable discount from the list below. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you go through the other 14 pages, what NADA and what Paul is saying is this form doesn't have to complete it on every deal, but just on any deal where the standard retail price is lower.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
And that makes it a lot handier for the F&I manager where we're only documenting when we deviate from the norm.
Would you talk about the reviewer certification and how many days after that and why that's so important and some of the options that we may have to do?
Well, what we're talking about now is oversight. I have reviewed the above information and supporting document and. So what we're saying is we're going to have oversight that what we did was properly documented, was applicable to the standards that we've had applied in that store, and that we're having oversight on that by somebody of authority to make sure that the policy was followed.
What do you think? We're going to have fun filling those out in the store, right?
Well, there's two problems there. We've got to have somebody fill out the form and then somebody review it with taking the time to review it. Incidentally, one of the ways you can get caught short is to have a policy that you don't properly enforce. We're going to talk a little bit about the standards of setting a policy and how it has to work to be legally defensible and effective.
Hey, let me ask you this. I've been in stores since 2014 with the Fair Credit Compliance Policy and Program, where I'm told that occasionally, and it varies by finance source, where the finance source that bought the paper has requested a copy of that form, along with the deal jacket that goes to the finance source. Do you see that maybe happening with this down the road, that a finance source will want to see this as well?
I don't think so, because I think what we're looking for in disparate pricing was a much broader issue, and it touched other elements of society about people not being treated fairly as it relates to credit. Now we're talking about an ancillary product. Other than a possible transgression, and this is the problem, if you haven't filled out the form and there's a transgression, you're going to be liable. If you filled out the form and it's not properly, correctly filled out, in other words, you mouse the form, you're going to have a problem. And if it's not reviewed by somebody with authority, you're going to have a problem. So what you've done is tripled the level of oversight that can come back and haunt you.
Bottom line is we have two appendices, right? Number one is that voluntary protection products policy that has to be displayed. And number two is what we just did, the voluntary protection products certification form. Let's turn to our next segment, our next section, the NADA best practices for menu presentations and disclosures. So for those of you that have this program in your store, what I'm looking at is actually page 16 of the NADA packet. The NADA best practices for menu presentations and disclosures, and the title is product presentation and sale. And the first two things we want to talk about, the two key ideas, we mentioned the first one a few minutes ago. And number one, the dealership will. And notice that when Paul wrote this, he didn't say shall or maybe or think about it, whatever. He's got the word will throughout this. He might talk about that. But the first will is the dealership will inform customers orally, interesting word, that the VPPs it offers are optional. So what they're saying is, hey, the VPP stands for Voluntary Protection Products. We inform the customer about that orally as you begin the presentation of your menu. Quite frankly, and many of us I know that are listening, that we've had in class and actually made this change since April and also in our May class for the initial introduction of the menu, incorporating this. And it's the 20 words of Mr. Customer, here's a menu breakdown. Here's a menu breakdown of your optional voluntary protection products that are available to protect your credit and your investment. So quite frankly, Dave, in those 20 words, we've got the, as I call the OVPP. Here's a menu breakdown of your optional voluntary protection products that are available to protect your credit and your investment. So that really ties into this and accomplishes what NADA's Paul Mitri is saying. So further comment on that as far as orally and the VPPs and the word optional?
Well, I had a dealer the other day ask me, said, what do you think of my menu, Dave? I said, well, it's a sales tool or an exhibit in court. So what you have to do is make sure that all these things are there. And one of the ones that seems to always be missing from these menus is that the products can be purchased separately and there's pricing relative to their standalone sale or purchase. So you have to tell the customer, we're not relying on the customer reading something, seeing the little poster. You have to tell that customer these products are optional. A good salesman will do that in a way that he satisfies both the spirit and the letter of this covenant, but do it in such a way that it won't inhibit him from presenting his product. Okay, the more simple the menu, the better. You get your customers lost in a sea of numbers if you get too many options, too many prices, and when a customer gets confused, he says no.
Very interesting. And that second bullet point, once again, is the dealership will present VPPs to customers in a standard, simple menu format that, at a minimum, prominently discloses. I'm a pretty simple guy, so when I first read this, I thought about, well, here's a crusade that I've been on for some time. So again, I went back to the dictionary and I looked up the word simple. And simple is defined or meaning being uncomplicated, easy to understand, having only one or a few parts. So to me, in my opinion, a simple menu format is a single column menu, as opposed to the 3, 4, or 5 things that we see around the world: platinum, gold, silver, custom, bronze. I always thought there ought to be tinfoil and rust if we're going after the precious metals. But think about what a customer sees or thinks about when they see that. Again, to me, it's the 3 questions on the mind of every customer that they will never ask, but they're thinking about. And those 3 questions are: can I trust you? Are you credible? And do you care? So many times, those forms with the 3 or 4 columns, it's redundancy, pricing is repeated, verbiage is repeated. So when the customer first looks at that, they got to be thinking that you're going to try to sell me everything on this page. Conversely, what I would like to have the customer feel is that, look, what we're going to do is that before we actually ask you to buy, we're going to present the options to you. We're going to tell them, what it is, what it does, what that means to you, and try to engage the customer in a conversation and promote the idea of conversational selling. So the dealership will present customers, VPPs to customers, in a standard, simple menu format that, at a minimum, prominently discloses. Now, there's 8 guidelines in this policy. Let's go through these together. We kind of covered the first 2, but we'll look at the third one again. Number 1, the first guideline from NADA, that the purchase of any listed VPP is optional. So we handled that in our menu introduction. Here's a menu breakdown of your optional voluntary protection products that are available to protect your credit and your investment. That any listed VPP may be purchased separately, needs to be on the menu, that you will. Number 3, that the purchase of any listed VPP is not required to purchase or lease a vehicle or to obtain warranty coverage, qualify for financing, or receive financing on particular terms. Dave, before we turn to the next slide, any other comment on any of these 3?
Yes, I want to make 2 comments on this. Number 1, what you can't do and shouldn't do is just shove a menu in front of a customer and say, which one of these do you want to have? So a good F&I person might say, by the way, when you own a car, what are the areas that cause you the greatest concern about breakdowns or challenges with that vehicle in the future? And then you can direct them then to the optional products that would maybe meet that customer's needs. But we get into a habit of working in the box. We just stick the menu in front of the customer and say, take a pick. Let me make a suggestion that I've recommended to a number of dealers. That is, you get some tablets and you load onto your tablet what your aftermarket product options are. And when the salesman finishes with the customer, they give him the tablet. It's self-prompting, and the millennial then can sit down and walk himself while he's waiting to go to the F&I box through the various options on that particular tablet. When he gets to the F&I box, he gives the tablet to the F&I manager. He's noted what he has an interest in. So we've done something productive with that customer between when the deal is signed and he gets into the box, and we know which way to go. We can be more effective with our menu without starting from square one.
That's a great idea. And saying that reminds me of something we covered in one of our previous webinars this year. And that is, Dave, the J.D. Power number of 187 minutes. I remember talking about that, 187 minutes. That was the J.D. Power number for last year that it takes that the average dealer to sell a new vehicle and for the customer to go through the F&I process. 187 minutes. I'm not real good with math, but that's just north of, 3 hours. But here's the kicker. What that survey also said is that as part of that 187, 32 minutes on average was downtime while the customer is sitting in the lounge or somewhere waiting to get into the F&I office. And in most cases, unfortunately, waiting for the customer, and they see the F&I manager, working on that magic menu behind the curtain before they ever go in. So what you're saying is, if they have this tablet, eliminates the downtime, And now we can really engage them when they come in and get into a conversation with questions that they have about our voluntary protection products.
As the millennials become a greater portion of the car buying public, they are certainly computer savvy. Incidentally, they like to buy aftermarket products, and they know how to manipulate a program. And so why, when they're sitting there looking at an old issue of People magazine, do we give them something more effective where they can work themselves into what product that causes them some heartburn if they buy the car? For example, you buy an expensive car, tire and wheel might be your first choice.
Okay. Again, that's the first 3 of these 8 guidelines that are part of this program. Let's look at the next 5 as part of the NADA program. And Dave, ask your comment on these as we go. Number 4, any comment that the listed VPPs or the protections they provide may be available from other sources. How do you feel about that?
I think I'd go light on that one. I mean, no salesperson is going to get up and say, by the way, I think the Ford store across the street has something that's a little better than the one we're selling here. So, but if the customer says, can I get these elsewhere, then you're going to have to say they are available. For example, you can go with an insurance company and buy certain products that are sold in a dealership.
But again, the NADA program says that this is already on the menu and it would be there. But
no, you have to tell them that you can get it somewhere else.
It has to be verbally, right? But it's written. Very good. Then number 5, you might say the same thing. Number 5, that the dealer may retain a portion of the sale price of the listed voluntary protection products. Your thoughts?
I think the one I disagree with on that is that anything I buy, when I'm at Sears or whatever, they say, Dave, if you buy this lawnmower, by the way, we're going to take a cut. So I mean, I don't. That's a lawyer's view of sales, and I would, if you have to say it or you're asked, you have to respond. But I think common sense would tell you, if I'm selling you something and I'm a merchant, that at some point in there's an element of profit.
You think part of their reasoning in putting this in and making this a recommendation for the simple menu format is because of what's in the retail installment sale contract, Section 4, that the dealer may be keeping a portion of these amounts. That's on every retail installment sale contract. Part of Truth in Lending doesn't have to disclose how much they're keeping. Then also the fact on the retail installment sale contract, when it comes to the finance charge, the dealer may retain a portion of that finance charge as well. So isn't this really saying the same thing, only it's directly related to voluntary protection products?
Well, but to me, that's just an element of commerce. I mean, you can't stay in business if you don't make a profit. So that's the one that I'm not saying it's wrong. And if somebody asked me, I would tell them. But I mean, whatever we buy daily, there's an assumption they're going to make a profit on it, or they couldn't stay in business.
Very good. Number 6, the price of and monthly payment for the vehicle without the purchase of a VPP. You know, we think that's pretty standard, like it in the stores, and guess what's not on the menu? The base payment, okay? Or the vehicle-only payment, or the principal and interest payment. What this is saying is the price of a monthly payment for the vehicle without the purchase of a VPP. Your thoughts on that?
Well, to make the transition, you should have the agreed-to price of the vehicle on the form to start with, so the customer understands there's a basis for what you're doing.
That takes us to number 7, okay? VPP is purchased separately. The price of and monthly payment for each voluntary protection product if purchased separately. Your thought?
Well, if they purchase it separately, of course. I mean, you buy a tire and wheel, it costs you so much. Now, you're going to get into a manipulation of numbers here when you have to readjust the monthly payment for each particular product. That one's going to be a tad cumbersome. And again, when the customer gets confused because you're confused, you're not going to sell anything.
And number 8, finally, the price of and monthly payment for each product bundle if VPPs are purchased as a bundle. Would you address that, but then also talk about maybe the good, the bad, the ugly with bundles, and what's happened with that, as I call them, bad bundles that have caused a lot of trouble for a lot of stores.
Well, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about that, because since that's a hot point with you.
Well, it's just the fact that, the disclosure is not there, that you can purchase them separately, okay? And the customer feels that to buy the product, they have to buy the bundle, and they can't be purchased separately, okay?
Well, I mean, at some point here, you're reaching a point of no return on the customer's time and what makes sense. If I've agreed to purchase a bundle of products and they've been properly priced, then I don't want to go back and have to dissect them just to say, if you bought 3 items, this is what those items cost.
Okay. Dave, where's this program going? Now, when I introduced Paul Mitri in, I guess it was May, he was a keynote speaker at the Agent Summit, and he went through this program, was real quiet when he was talking about this. And he said they were getting the release, the introduction, and sharing this with our industry. Subsequent to that, I've seen one large article about it in Automotive News. I'm sure there will be more to come. He also stated that he or his staff will be visiting state dealer associations. I'm sure NADA especially, 20 group coordinators, 20 group people will be a hold of this and will be presenting it in their stores. So from an agent product provider standpoint, how would you address this? How would you handle it?
The thing we found in APEP certification is that for those dealers that want to do well, they get certified because they can do well with a higher degree of frequency and accuracy. They want to do well, they want to get better. For those dealers that don't want to do well, and I mean by that in a consumer-related do well, they're not going to do it. So now, what does this program do? It gives the dealers who want to do well a guide to do it. Unfortunately, for the dealers that don't want to do well, it's going to become exhibits in court. Because now we have set parameters for performance from a reputable organization for a just cause protecting the consumer. And if you don't do these things, then it is not going to bode well for you if you get challenged.
Very good. Again, I go back to the hows. How many did we sell? How much did we make? We've got that. But what this seems to be saying, and is saying, we need to be concerned of the answer to the 4 other hows when it comes to our voluntary protection products. How are they offered? How are they sold? How are they disclosed? And then how are they administered, primarily from a standpoint of claims and cancellations. You kind of used that word claims and cancel earlier. Would you talk about that for a minute, claims and cancellations?
If there's a disconnect in aftermarket products, is an early termination. They've been canceled. And now everybody has to give back their prorated portion of the profit and that they generated or the amount of unearned risk on that particular program. So dealers are going to have now more than ever a defined program where how each party to that process is identified and you can quantify what they have to give back and that there's a process in place to see that it is given back. I mean, if there's an area of disconnect on aftermarket products, and I've been in this business for 40 years, is when it comes to cancellation. And who always ends up on the short end of the stick is the consumer. So now when we talk about the big squeeze, we have a squeeze on pricing. In other words, is it fair? Is it defensible? We're going to have a squeeze on when an agreement is canceled. Did the customer receive full value for that canceled product? You're going to have to be able to defend that. I want to talk 1 second, just a little bit on what we talk about. We're talking about policies. So let's talk about this for a second, what constitutes a policy. Number 1, it has to be in writing. Well, they say in the car business, if it ain't written down, it didn't happen. Number 2, there has to be proof that it was communicated to the people that are charged with abiding by that policy. There's got to be training. Number 3, there has to be proof of oversight to see that the policy is being complied with. Number 4, you have to have documentation for remedial action taken if, in fact, the policy was not followed. And in a general sense, government is pushing greatly for how to handle consumer complaints. So do you have a written, established policy for that? It has a procedure, it's communicated to the consumer, There is a written record of how it was handled when it was settled, and that we can prove that what we've done was done properly, and the consumer was aware of every element that was pertinent to that individual.
Very good. Great job. Dave, before we yield back to John Friedland for any questions, comments, and concerns from our participants, let me just say again that from a standpoint of a disclaimer, and that both Dave Robertson and myself, we're not attorneys. We certainly don't pretend to be. So nothing that we have said, given, or showed you today is intended in any way as legal advice. It's simply to help you look at, evaluate, and if necessary, perhaps, improve the overall effectiveness of your business policies, your business practices. Obviously, and I think we know this in the field, you want to discuss this information with your attorney, a qualified attorney, with respect to these policies and procedures before you would adopt them, and how you would specifically change them for your store. Before I yield back to John, and we're almost at the 45-minute time, let me just say that our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, October 16th. That'll be 1 p.m. Central, as all of them are. We want to thank Dave Robertson from AFIP joining us today and providing with this latest up-to-date information. We plan to use Dave on these webinars on a regular basis, not for the entire 45 minutes or so, but maybe as this information changes quarterly, have Dave join us for a compliance corner update for the first 5, 10, 12 minutes as it relates to the latest with respect to the CFPB, the DOJ, and the attorneys general as well. Bottom line here at American Guardian Group of Companies, American Guardian Morning Services University, as always, our commitment to you, is to you, to our agent partners, our dealer clients, to help you maximize deal profit, but that is to do it the right way. And the right way is in a manner that's consistent with good customer relations and sound business practices. John Friedland.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Dave. Looking here, I don't see any active Q&A questions here on the panel. That's okay. If you think of anything at a later date, please email bharkins, that's BHARKINS @agwsinc.com, or myself, Jay Friedland, JFREEDLUND @agwsinc.com, and we can get you answers to any questions that you may have. As always, for a recording of this presentation, that will also be available to either of those emails that I just listed. We can send that out and then answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much for your time today, and thanks again to our industry experts that were able to join us, both Dave Robertson and Bob Harkins. Thank you very much. Have a good day.